My name is Bea Banyu, and I'm chair of food studies. I'm going to take a little minute to introduce you, those of you who are not familiar with the food studies program here at the new school. Food studies program offers a variety of courses in culture, media, history, science, and the politics of food. We run 3 undergraduate degree programs, a BA, a BS, and a 2-year AAS program. And of course, we always welcome students of all ages and backgrounds to take our continuing education classes and to attend our public programming. This is the last formal public program for the semester. However, there is a related event tomorrow evening called Food, Power, and Politics. And that will open in the Parsons Aronson Gallery, which is on 5th Avenue and 13th Street. This is actually an exhibition devoted to Roxy Payne's Dinner of the Dictators, which is part of the New School art collection. It's going to be the focal point of the exhibition, and tomorrow Fabio Parasecoli will, in fact, moderate a panel discussion about that. I believe it starts with a reception at 6, and then the discussion takes place at 7. Fabio, is that right?
Sorry?
The discussion starts at 7, the reception at 6? I'm fuzzy on this. Anyway, you can, oh, yes?
It starts at 6 in the Orozco room.
Oh, it starts at 6 in the...
The exhibition is going on until January 4th, so you can go there anytime. But the
Okay.
panel discussion with Fabio's moderating.
At 6 in the Orozco room, which is at 66 West 12th Street on the 7th floor. That's the curator of our art collection. She knows. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Food Studies is also working on a program that we hope to offer at the end of January on America's founding mothers, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and Dolly Madison. And we have a conference scheduled toward the end of the spring on April 28th and 29th in conjunction with the Institute of Culinary Education, and the conference is Zero Food Waste. So I encourage you, if you're interested in any of our public programming, to give one of the people at the table your email address so we can keep you informed. Or you can just check the New School website for the calendar. In addition, we actually have an online magazine called The Inquisitive Eater, the New School Food, which provides a kind of forum for artists and writers and academics to explore the intersection between food and family, the environment, politics, economics, social justice, and the media. And you're invited to submit your short stories, personal essays, poems, reviews of books, movies, TV, visual art, multimedia projects, and the academic work. So anybody is invited to submit work. So let me get to our authors, Laura Lindenfeld and Fabio Parasecoli. Whoops, we just lost that. You're back. Okay. Laura is actually the director of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science and a professor of journalism at Stony Brook. The Alan Alda Center works to enhance understanding of science by helping train the next generation of scientists and health professionals to communicate more effectively with the public officials, the media, and others outside their own discipline. This is a recent role she began playing after a long stint at the University of Maine. In Maine, she rose from assistant research professor to director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center and professor of communication and journalism. Laura's research actually falls into 2 main categories: critical media studies and linking knowledge to action. As a humanities scholar, she produced a whole body of scholarship that investigates the role of food in diverse forms of media, in particular, food films. She also looked at food TV, food advertising, and other food-related media. Her research resulted in lots of publications, articles, book chapters, edited journals, and presentations. Her publications helped to advance research in the study of media and food. The second major thread of her research was born out of frustration that her work was not having a real social impact. Retraining herself as a social scientist, she developed expertise in creating linkages between university research and societal need. She led the development of a social science lab at the University of Maine called Linking Knowledge with Action. Her work focuses on environmental communication, which I knew absolutely nothing about until I was reading about her, which seems to be a new and increasingly important field that pertains to the effective communication of messages about the environment among stakeholders at a local, regional, national, and global level. Now at the Alan Alda Center, Laura's research helps to create a space for team-based collaborative research, and there are lots of publications coming out of this line of research. For Fabio Parasecoli. Fabio is actually the director of Food Studies Initiatives and associate professor of food studies here at the New School. As the former and first chair of the Food Studies program here, he created all the programs I mentioned before this, right? All of them, his. He's also spearheading some graduate initiatives in both New York and Parsons in Paris. Fabio has just concluded 3 long-term research cycles. One on the history of Italian food, the second on place-based names for food products, and the third, food and film, which has resulted in lots of articles, book chapters, talks, keynotes, interviews, and some books. His research on the history of Italian food led to the recent publication of Al dente, which was originally actually written in English and then translated into Italian, which could mean lots of trouble, but he did pretty well in Italy. And now it's actually being translated into Korean. Interesting, yes, okay. His work on geographical indications, which he's editing today, and other place-based marks will lead to the publication of a new book called Unequal Territories, which we will also celebrate here sometime next year, I'm sure. And lastly, his work on food and film has culminated in the publication of Feasting Our Eyes, which today's celebration is all about. Fabio is a frequent contributor to Huffington Post. He has engaged in something he likes to call public teaching, which, for example, means pop-up classes in the green market, and the creation of several massive open online courses, the next of which will actually be on food insecurity. He has appeared on TV and radio here and in Europe. Fabio has now embarked on a new research project, just like Laura. They've both sort of embarked on brand new projects very recently. I mean, that book must have taken a lot out of you, right? Anyway, and Fabio's field is food design, which includes any action that can improve our relationship with food, either individually or collectively. These actions can relate to the design of food products, materials, practices, environments, systems, processes, and experiences. Food design embraces approaches that are practical and project-oriented, which are meant to actually introduce real and tangible change into complex food systems, very much like Laura's new work in trying to get theory into practice. So they're both engaged now in new research projects that are focused on taking theory and putting it into practice. Clearly, for both Laura and Fabio, the book, Feasting Our Eyes, Food, Films, and Cultural Identity in the United States, the publication of which we are celebrating tonight, and the books from which we will be selling later on, if you haven't already purchased one, is the culmination of years of research, study, and watching films. Not so bad, that. And so let me turn the podium over to them so they can, actually, we're not doing that. They're sitting there and I'm staying here. You're going to do that? Okay. So that they can introduce us to the American food film. Laura, Fabio?
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Bea and Chrissy and everybody here for helping organizing. I'd like to thank also our dean, where is she? There she is, Mel, and our provost Tim is here too. Thank you so much. So we're very happy to have the opportunity to do this here, and we prepared a little visual presentation. Just since we're talking about food, we thought it would be a good idea. And then we'll be taking questions, and then there will be book signing and some food and wine. So shall we start? All right.
I do want you to keep eating your popcorn, however. It sets just the right tone for this presentation. Everybody got quiet when we stepped up here. Thank you for hosting this. What does it mean to feast our eyes on media that features food? What happens to us when we consume these images? What changes in us, and how do we influence what then comes out on screens? How does it shape us? How does it shape us through culture? How does it enable us to participate as citizens or not? Food seems so normal and natural. How many of you study food here? So you know that that's not the case. There's all kinds of ideologies embedded with food, and when we open that proverbial can of worms, we can read so much about politics. This book really focuses on what does it mean to be a citizen, and how do food films help shape our participation or lack thereof in such subtle ways. Here's the nutshell version. Great food metaphor, right? Nutshell. These films, they look very progressive from the veneer, but when you crack them open, they tend to undermine progressive politics. So they give with one hand and take back with the other. What we'll talk about tonight is the whole evolution of food and film, but really hone in on films that started in the 1980s that form a kind of genre. So let's jump right into it.
All right.
Fabio will take it from here.
Okay, so we'll start with a little bit of history. Food has been in movies since the beginning. I mean, the meal of the baby in 1895 already had, a food scene, one of the first movies. But the first movie I want to talk about is this one by D.W. Griffith, known for other kind of movies. But this one is a shorter one, came out in 1919, and it's the first one where actually food is used to do a social critique. And at the time, it was the critique of what was happening in the transition to wheat becoming part of the stock market. So before, people would go to the fields and buy from distributor and whatnot. At this point, there are people getting rich off wheat. So I think historically it's very interesting, and it's also one of the first representations of whole meal, as you can see, and of bread consumption. Historically, I think it has a very important role. This is the one I was mentioning before. We just inverted the slides. Food continued being present in silent movies for the simple reason that there was no dialogue. And so you needed a lot of action. You needed to entertain the audience. So physical action, physical comedy was perfect. So there you go, the pie, and then you have the bananas and all of that, those tropes that have stayed somehow in comedic movies. But it's interesting that they sort of developed around food. Later on, this is my people. I don't know if you know who this is. This is Benito Mussolini, who was one of the first communicators. I mean, he was a dictator, but he was also a communicator. And he realized that food was a very important way to control his people in a very physical, very direct way. So what he did, he also included food in the state propaganda, and here we see him in documentaries where he goes on the fields and actually participates in the harvest. So he was the father of Italy. He was sort of the Übermensch. I mean, in Italian it would be called something else, but you understand the concept. And it was very important to show him producing food, participating in this sort of abundance coming from the Italian soil. So in the 30s, 40s, we see food used in a very direct political way for propaganda. And we see that also in Nazi Germany. And just today, I published a piece on the Huffington Post on what was happening also in Salazar's Portugal. There is a new book called Fascist Pigs. I strongly recommend it. It's a history book of how science and technology of food were really fundamental for the development of Nazism, fascism, and Salazar's regime. So immediately after, you have a new way of looking at food. Italian neorealism developed as a reaction to fascism. Basically, these were young filmmakers that had been trained to become documentarists and filmmakers in Mussolini's schools. As soon as fascism fell and the war was over, they started making movies to show the reality of Italy, all its problems, the poverty, the social tensions. So food becomes a way to transmit all these values, all these problems that had been hidden for 20 years. And so here you have two very important movies, Bicycle Thieves, probably many of you have seen it, and The Earth Trembles. That's a little less known, but I strongly recommend it. It's in Sicilian dialect, but it's subtitled, so I don't even understand it in Italian. It's a very interesting film because it looks at the life of fishermen in eastern Sicily and their poverty and the fact that they were fishing and working very hard just to survive because everything was taken away from them. So already in these 60 years, we see the continuous presence of food, but food was used mostly, let's say, to discuss specific issues or, as we'll see later, to point out elements in the narrative rather than being the main character of what was going on in the film.
So I'm curious how many food film fans are in this audience. What are your favorite food films? Let me hear some of them. Tampopo. What else? Big Night. That's my favorite. Babette's Feast. What else? Boy, that's a gruesome one. That's your favorite one? He's got a dark sense of humor, this guy. What else? Tom Jones. That's the original U.S. foodie scene in film. Yeah.
The Chinese father with the three daughters.
Yeah.
Remember the name?
Eat, Drink, Man, Woman.
That's it.
Yep. What's yours?
Hook with the imaginary food scene.
Oh, that's good.
Recalls, very colorful.
Yeah.
Put in.
Yeah, we did not write about that one. This is another book we need to write. Willy Wonka, excellent. We start to see, what I love about studying these films is you can really track changes in the political climate. You can track changes around multiculturalism. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with food media over the coming years. We can talk about that when we're done. What we start to see in the late 60s, early 70s, we start to see food take on a more prominent role. And there's also a technology now that allows you to show the food a little bit more up close than, for example, in a silent film where you had the camera sitting in one spot. And film starts to take on this social critique emphasis, like in La Grande Bouffe, where people eat themselves to death, or Alice's Restaurant. We had to throw that in there just because it's about Thanksgiving. And then we start to see around the 80s this genre, and you mentioned a number of these, some really beautiful international films. You'll notice the book focuses on the US, and there's a reason for that. We're tracking something about the United States and how it adopts these films. Babette's Feast, Tampopo, that start to circulate in art house cinema. Do people remember going to see these at the time? I remember driving into Sacramento when I was at grad school at UC Davis to see films like Babette's Feast or Tampopo in the 80s. And they really mark this transition where food starts to change quite dramatically in films. Or like Water for Chocolate, you said the cook, I threw that in there just for you. You're welcome. Food starts to become much more central to the plots, whereas Fabio talked about food's appearances in these early films, it takes on a very different dynamic. And what we see is the evolution of a new visual style. Food is shot in close-up. Do you remember what year the Food Network starts, Fabio? 92. 92? So this is, you can see how that visual style starts to lead up to what we see as food porn. Are you familiar with this term? Food shot in close-up, glistening. Whole new food designers emerge, new camera abilities to shoot the food in close-up. This, of course, from Babette's Feast, which may be my second favorite food film, next to Big Night. Here's some other images of this close-up. So the food really starts to take center stage. And indeed, the plots, one of the things we argue is that the plots center around food. The films become about food, rather than food simply appearing in them. Food starts to take on a character. You'll even hear, I think I have one more slide on this, like water for chocolate. If you pay really close attention, for example, the film Chocolat, have you seen this film? Yes. It has its own soundtrack. So there's this particular sound that comes out when there's chocolate that signals the food takes on its own character. It's a significant shift.
And also the audio changes. You know, now they had directional microphones, so you hear the sounds of, I don't know, simmering water or sounds that, you know, in reality you would not hear that loud. But they become very important because they're a way for the filmmakers to draw the audience in. Since you cannot actually eat the food, you work with your eyes and with your ears. Sometimes we don't think about the audio, but that's really, really important in the development of this genre. So we come to the first real food film in the US, which is Big Night in 1996. It started also as an indie movie, but very shortly it became a big success. And it is important because it's the first time where American filmmakers look at themes that had already emerged in this sort of European art house movies like that we've discussed before, or Japanese ones, and try to bring those ideas, those themes into the American culture. And it's interesting that it happens in a story about immigrants and integration. I don't know if you remember the movies, if you've seen it. It's about these two brothers who come from Italy, and they want to make Italian food as they know it from where they come from. And the clients don't understand it. There is a famous scene where, you know, they're offered risotto and they don't know what to do with it, and they ask for pasta and then the meatballs. There was a whole miscommunication going on. But besides the theme, the centrality of food really becomes very clear. And half of the movie is actually a large dinner that will be separated by signs that explains to you what's happening, in which part of the dinner they are. The visual techniques are the ones that have been developed in these international food movies. The impact was so strong and the success so sudden, and I think a little unexpected for the filmmakers, that suddenly Hollywood thought, there might be money to make out of this. And that's the beginning a little bit of the food genre here in the US. That, of course, reflects American society. That's why we chose the title, in the title, to focus on cultural identity, because we do believe that food films are not just, you know, sort of floating there, but really the reflex of dynamics that happen in American society, and somehow they not only reflect them, but also participate in generating these dynamics. So what are the themes that emerged? Of course, the male chef. It's a classic. There is this idea that, you know, and here I know that there are many professional women chefs, but, you know, in France in the 19th century, in this sort of culture, the chef was male. And this is one of the themes that food films have embraced with a vengeance, I must say. Some with more success. Chef is overall a nice movie. It's all about the story of this man and his child that socialize around food, and they work in a food truck. They travel the US together, and they build a new relationship. Or you have bad ones like Burnt, which is sort of the story of the burnt chef, also a big sort of trope. In anybody who works in the restaurant business, you know, this idea of the chef as a bad boy, but also hyper masculine, creative, but incapable to actually control his own instincts. It's the distillation of models of masculinity that, you know, somehow are problematic. These models show their limits when the chefs are ethnic. So here we have two movies about Indian chefs, and we can start seeing how Hollywood look at ethnic chefs in a different way. So yes, they are creative, they are masculine, they are the alpha males, but not so much. They negotiate their power, their position of power in American society or in other societies. Here it's also in France, in a very different way, because they're not white, and they have to somehow show the fact that they can control and use the European techniques of cuisine. Both of these movies are about that. These are Indians that want to learn about French cuisine. In today's special, eventually the chef embraces Indian cuisine, but the way the white chef and the ethnic chef is represented is quite different. Then there are movies that shows completely different models of masculinity. In Cooking with Stella, for instance, we have the husband of a female diplomat that travels to India, doesn't know what to do, and wants to learn how to cook Indian food from their maid. And of course, the maid doesn't want him in the kitchen. I mean, that's a female space, and he's white. And so it becomes a very interesting conversation about gender and race. The other one, we also have the figure of a father that it's somehow much more maternal than the mothers of the children. So these are some of the cases in which the food film makes a critique of the gender roles and the gender relations in the US.
What's so fascinating about these films is that they tend to depict food as utopic. Food becomes this ideal, and what's often lost is the labor or work behind the food. So to emphasize again what Fabio said, we look at these food films as a site of contention. So it's not that they go in one direction or the other, but they play out these kinds of anxieties that we have around our bodies, around power, around politics, in very subtle, often unconscious ways. Films like It's Complicated or Life as We Know It. I want to come back to the point about masculinity that Fabio made. There's a whole series of food films where you see men who have been professional chefs finding themselves in the domestic sphere. So Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, Tortilla Soup, Heavy, Spanglish. And they have to work against that being placed in the domestic sphere. It somehow is wrong. So they have to emerge on the other side. We'll get in a minute to what happens with women. You can probably imagine that. But we start to see food business emerge in these films. The ones that focus on men, and there are more films that focus on men as professional chefs than on women, but they go in the opposite direction in terms of the power that men and women are granted. It's very striking when you look at these. So women tend to go back into the domestic sphere. You've probably seen Julia and Julia, right? There's a pattern, especially, all of these films, by the way, that start women out in the professional sphere and move them back into the home, feature white women. So this kind of hierarchy emerges within these films where really you see these sites of contention and debate that we engage in emerging through story, which we then consume. And we believe that shapes us. We shape it. So Julia and Julia, she starts out working in post 9/11 New York, is quite traumatized, and she recedes to the home where she dons these 1950s clothes, mixes martinis, and works her way through Julia Child's cookbook. Even though she blogs, she really finds her safety in the domestic sphere. And again, we had to throw another Thanksgiving film in here, Pieces of April. Have you seen this one about a disastrous Thanksgiving meal? So when women are chefs, they can't completely own their power. No Reservations, which is something of a knockoff of the German film Mostly Martha, Bella Mata, which I've also written about. That's a wonderful film if you haven't seen it. She can't be a purveyor of knowledge. She can't own the knowledge of cooking without adding emotion to it. And this can't happen until she steps back into a more domesticized kitchen and work together with her new beau to have something more like a cafe than an upscale restaurant. It's an unbelievable pattern that we saw here. Ratatouille is one of the few films, actually, where a female chef speaks up and says, I have to work so hard to be a woman in the kitchen. It's actually remarkable that that emerges in a cartoon film. Gets even worse when we look at women of color. Whereas the white female chefs who appear on screen start out as professional chefs and move into the domestic sphere, there's an even more troubling discourse around women of color when they do appear. Their bodies tend to be connected directly with food. So in Woman on Top, if you look at the poster, there's a picture of hot chili peppers that mirror her mouth. So women actually become food. They become equated directly with food. And then beyond that, drawing on the film like Water for Chocolate and really muddying up that the pattern in that film. Do you remember how magic, women's bodies can infuse magic? You see this pattern of food becoming magical primarily when it's prepared by women of color, but it's often reduced to the erotic. So it takes out all of the socio-political context of films like Water for Chocolate and reduces them to an erotic display. And we have two examples here of that, which go in slightly different directions, but nonetheless, they situate women within their homes, or in Woman on Top, she goes on television, but she's extremely eroticized and sexualized throughout the film. Are you talking about this one? I can't remember. Okay, go ahead.
So,
We can both do them.
yes, and that's something that we want to also discuss. We worked together in a way that was very interesting. We were writing pieces and send it to the other, and after a while, we lost any property on what we had written. So there was no problem about erasing, adding, changing. It was a very good experience, very liberating. I strongly recommend it if it happens like this, because I know that writing, together can be a little complicated. So we worked on every movie together, literally, even if the beginning came from one of us. So culinary tourism, it's a very interesting theme too, because when you're looking at others, a community that are of color, for instance, here we have soul food in African Americans, what's cooking, it's about different communities, it's about Latinos, Vietnamese, Jews. You have this opportunity for the viewer to go on what we decided to call culinary tourism. Basically, you look at the community, you are given the opportunity to sort of peep inside, but you're not really engaged with the community. You stay at a distance. You don't become involved in the problems or the stories or the dynamics of these communities. And in these kind of movies, there's always sort of a guide figure, because the viewer is supposed not to know about these communities. So you need an interpreter. For instance, in Soul Food, you have a little child that narrates the story, but also explains what happens. So if you don't know what happens on a Sunday in a black family, he's there to tell you, more or less. And that's, in a way, increases this impression of tourism, right? You're there, you even have a guide explaining you what happens. And by the way, there are food movies that do not embrace that sort of approach. Recently, Daughters of the Dust has been reissued. I strongly recommend it because it's about this community of women in the islands of the coast of Georgia. And food is really central to the story, but there is no...
It really defies that.
Exactly. It's not about eroticism of the movie. It's not about somebody looking into the community. It's the story of the community told by the women who are living through a major change in their life.
Gullah culture.
The Gullah culture, yes. So since the success of food films was clearly very interesting for Hollywood, of course, then they started appearing also in cartoons. We already discussed Ratatouille, but also we have others, Kung Fu Panda and Princess and the Frog. And these are both interesting because, again, they're about ethnic others. Kung Fu Panda happens in China. his father, who's a goose, go figure, speaks with a sort of ridiculous fake Chinese accent that is almost offensive. In The Princess and the Frog, you have the first African-American princess in a Disney movie, but of course she starts as a cook, and she keeps on cooking through the whole movie. Just at the end, sort of, oh yeah, she's a princess, and she's given also the garb and all of that. Kung Fu Panda is also interesting because there's the presence of body image that is discussed. The panda is really always hungry, he needs food, and so is made fun of because it's overweight. So there's also this theme that seeps through, and we've seen it in many of the movies, both when men and women are the protagonists, in different ways, of course. Because when there is an overweight woman, the approach is of a certain kind. If it's an overweight man, the approach is quite different. And then we want to finish with documentaries. So far we've looked at fiction movies. But in the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen also a boom in documentaries. So reality-based films. The issue is, are they all reality-based? We think that there are two kinds of documentaries. One kind that Laura will discuss, but I will start with this, where basically all the themes and the tropes of the genius, creative chef become put at the center of the story. So in a way, it's not so different from the fictional movie. And there is also the presence of the food porn shots. The stories are about these men. In these movies, most of the featured chefs are men. Very rarely we see women. And their creativity, their professionalism, their engagement with what they do is brought in a way that, yes, it's reality, but the themes are really taken out from the fictional movies that we've discussed before. But not all the documentaries are like this.
So while some food films participate in the fetishization, eroticization, beautification of food, there are others, and we close this book with an analysis of these. And I would say somebody should write a book on food documentaries, because there's none out there, and it's begging to be good. I'm glad you're on it. No? Yes. But somebody should. Volunteers, anyone? Because I'm not doing it. Are you doing it? Although if I got to write with him again, I might. There's a series of films that talk back. And I want to come back to your lovely introduction of both of us. I believe if you study food long enough, you find your way to the environment, because food comes from some place. And that's exactly how I found my way to doing engaged research. We close the book with these food documentaries because they do talk back. They call to action. I would say both of us love the films that we studied. We're fans. It's not that we hate them and we just pick them apart. And in some ways, when you study something you love, you're taking apart the stories that are in your head. When we called it Feasting Our Eyes, we called it that because when we ingest food, it becomes part of our cellular makeup. When we ingest stories, they become part of our identity. They change us. They condition us, and we in turn condition them. It's a very dynamic and fluid process. These films are interesting because they step back. It's almost as if they're collectively talking back at the series of food films, narrative food films that emerged in the 90s and early 2000s in the US.
So,
We can go back.
yes, we want to stop here because we hope that in the future, there will be, we're in a university, there will be young filmmakers that will start rethinking about this tradition that now has 20 years of the food film and see what elements can be used to promote change and social innovation and social critique. We hope somebody, also in our media school or somebody will take that up. And I think we'll stop here. I would just like to thank also David Van Zandt, the president of the new school, is here. Thank you for coming. And Jennifer Crew, who's the director of Columbia University Press. We really want to thank you for allowing us to work together on this project. It was very good to work with them, so thank you so much. So we'll just sit down and we'll open it to discussion. If you have questions, we'll be more than happy to try to answer. Microphones. Please remember to speak into the microphones because we're taping. Otherwise, your voices could not be heard. Somebody's taking the, okay.
And we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts?
Whoever wants to go first. Fabio, love you. Definitely work with the university, and I'm so glad we're really boosting up our food study programs here at the new school. One of the things that I definitely focused on one of my undergrad programs was a really interesting series. It was Gourmet's Diary of a Foodie. Fabulous series. The series was really about going into people's cultures, not necessarily the producers, but they really did it from the foodie perspective, whoever was writing in that area, and can talk about the food and talk about the culture and talk about what is going on. It made you kind of like look at things differently. For example, of course, I've been to Spain and I know about jamón, you know, it's different from our ham. But they went into the, like, why it's different and why they were like cultivating it out into the grains, and why they ate differently, and why their fat was differently, and why when you picked it up, it melted in your hand as opposed to everything else. I really would love to see more of that. I know we're in the process of health. I'm definitely focused on in my grad program, health and food. But I also want to talk about cultural, not just the U.S. and not just broadening it, but why is that different from our ham and different from everyone else's? And I know it's cultural, but is that going to be more of a, I don't know how to do the film. But.
That's sort of the transition that we hope will happen. So what you're describing are clearly non-fictional films focused on explaining a culture. So sometimes that allows the filmmaker to lose the point of view of the culinary tourist and let the people speak and tell their stories. In fiction, that is not happening yet. So we hope that, you know, now that the genre has 20 years, you know, it can develop in that direction, which is not necessarily a documentary, but somehow tells different stories. We have some small examples. Fast Food Nation, for instance, is a fictional movie based on the book that puts together different themes that really look at issues of immigration, of exploitation, but it's still one of the rare cases, especially in the US, where everything is about aesthetics, is about foodie culture, is about enjoying good food. Nothing wrong about that. We all love good food, but you know, you could do also different things.
Can I just ask one more question?
Let me just add one short thing to that, and that is the discourse of social class that so often goes unnoticed. How much is the concept of foodie laden with a certain understanding of class and the power that goes along with that? And the other piece is that you see increasing segmentation of the food media market. You know, when I think back when I first started looking at these films was about when we met, like 1998. Big Night was the first film to come out, and it was there for a while before you saw more. You just have seen an incredible growth of food media. So you have a number of shows like this, A Chef's Table, that really dig into the details of how a particular food is produced, where it comes from.
But, and also coming from a film background in terms of dialogue and storyline, how interesting is it? I mean, Chocolat was interesting because it was a cultural film, of course, you know, and then you're looking at other things like Water for Chocolate was definitely one. But how is it so, I don't know how to like make that film to talk about in a cinematic way that may not necessarily be about film, but culturally relevant, and then also about food. I don't know. I think that's where I'm a little bit.
If you think
hard.
about the whole concept of transmediation and multiple platforms, there are already lots of interesting works that look at that possibility. Maybe somebody will look at how to put together movies and online elements and maybe virtual reality to tell stories in different ways. I mean, just the other day I was reading about this article about virtual reality, and it's not about story, it's about sort of emotion, immersing yourself in an environment. So, I mean, the sky's the limit. It's just a question of exploring the media opportunities that are already there.
So we're flipping the whole thing on media and big screen.
Well,
Well, a lot of these films emerge as a kind of part of a subgenre of romantic comedies.
Yes.
So that preconditions them for a certain type of story, which means they're going to focus on being romantic. We didn't even really get into, I mean, there's so many details to talk about how heterosexist these films are. Even films like, what's the one? Iggy and Ruth.
Fried
Green Tomatoes, it really erases any genuine traces of homosexuality and just hints at a lesbian relationship. So think about the genre from which these emerge. These are not war films. You would see a very different discourse around food if you saw food movies emerging within a different genre, generic tradition. Good question. Tough one.
Hi, I'm Tara Montgomery. I'm actually with the Health and Food team at Consumer Reports. I'm curious about what observations you had or insights you have into product placement in any of the films that you've seen. When somebody drinks a can of Coke or goes to a fast food restaurant or eats anything, how much is going on behind the scenes in terms of what that is and the motivation that's not artistic?
Well, very often you don't see specific brands. Sometimes you do, but it's not that frequent. It's more about promoting certain kinds of consumption. So the fine dining restaurant, or when you cook, you need to have certain instruments and cook in a certain way and have a certain stove. So it does promote specific kinds of consumption. But so far, there haven't been many films that actually have a product placement like we see, for instance, in action movies or romantic comedies. Brands are usually not very present. That doesn't mean that food films are not used then to sell. For instance, Big Night is a very interesting example because when it came out, suddenly you had restaurants organizing Big Night dinners, and you have cookbooks about Big Night dinners. And so there is a lot of consumption that is promoted, but not specifically related to brands, I think.
Yeah, you see marketing tie-ins books. So there was a novelization of Big Night. Big Night really was it changed the dialogue about food movies in the U.S. So it came out, it grossed $4 million. People were shocked. Suddenly you saw a cookbook with a sticker, the original timpano recipe in bright red on the front of the book. And then there was a soundtrack. And then as you looked at films like Chocolat and other films that came out in the wake of Big Night, they had all these products. But I can't think of an example where there's actually been food product placement within a food movie. At the same time, a lot of these films, especially the ones in the 90s, recreate the kinds of atmospheres you might have seen as companies like Starbucks or Olive Garden were growing. So it's the same kind of architectural style within the restaurants. Again, really linked to issues of social class and consumption.
Thank you.
Oh, that's right.
Hello, I'm Petra Volpe. I'm a filmmaker from Switzerland and Italy. And I have some funny story about this because I wrote Heidi, the new cinema movie that's maybe going to be out also in the US. And it's like the classic Swiss story. And I wrote the screenplay, and there she drinks a lot of goat milk, like, you know. But I didn't put in the cheese thing. So my producer calls me and says, you have to put a raclette scene in the movie.
Interesting.
You have to write a scene where they take the cheese off and put it on the bread and eat it. And so I really had to add a raclette scene to the Heidi movie, and it was difficult to squeeze in. And as a director also, very often they do a lot of product placement. They drink a certain milk, they eat certain products, you make deals.
Yeah.
And it's clear you need the sponsorship of them, and so you sell your soul to sell some cheese. Yes.
But that's very interesting because you're also trying to sell Switzerland.
Yes.
Hence the raclette. So it's not maybe connected with a specific brand of raclette, but the fact that, you go on the Swiss Alps and you'll get that. And we see that in many of the movies that have some of this culinary tourism. It becomes also a way to attract people to certain culture, to certain places. But it's very interesting.
Hi, my name is Scott. I have done some research on food and film, and one of the things I think I heard you say, Fabio, was that you didn't see food as a character. Did I hear you say that right?
Sorry?
That you did not see food as a character?
No, food is a character.
Okay, because I wanted to make sure of that, because one of the things I'm curious about, some of the stuff I've done on food and film, is where it's not the romantic comedy, maybe the exception in what I'm thinking about is Manhattan, but where food is the signpost for the narrative in a ways that might be implicit or explicit. I'm thinking of films like Hiroshima Mon Amour, or Black Girl, or what's the other one I was thinking of? Well, Manhattan, you can see this consummation of relationship that Alan and Marielle Hemingway have, foreshadowing his life later. And Diane Keaton and Tony Roberts can never consummate it, and it's always about food. And the food tells you where it's going to go if you can't get it from there, or before the narrative lets you see that.
But see, that's the difference between the, a film in which food is used as a prop, as a signpost, and the food film genre, where food is not a character, is the protagonist, is the main character. It becomes the engine for the action. So we see that in all kinds of movies. I wrote my dissertation on action movies and masculinity through food. And you have food scenes that you don't notice, but they're there and they're very significant in Spider-Man, Troy, and The Lord of the Rings. So food as a symbol, as a way to allow people to express themselves, to push the plot forward. It's been there since the 20s, the 30s.
Sure.
Yeah.
What happens with food films is that food from a prop becomes the main protagonist, becomes the engine, and all the characters define themselves in their relationship to food. So that's, what you're saying, you could write not a book, you could write an encyclopedia.
And I guess the thing was intriguing to me, thinking about the dialectic between them, is where it isn't the food film that you're speaking about, but where it could maybe speak implicitly about what you can't speak explicitly.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's why it's been there for so long.
And I think Black Girl is a perfect example of that one. By Usman Sembene. Thanks.
We cannot but agree.
Thank you very much for this fantastic presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. I'm Rosy Silva with the Milano School of International Affairs and also the Parsons School of Design. Very interested about the relationship between food and cities and sustainable development. And of course, this new sentiment that we need to develop, going back to your point about citizenship, right? A new idea of what it means to be a citizen and I think the lens of food definitely help us. And in our Western society, we are so influenced now by, of course, films, right? And they shape part of our citizenship. So going back to your point about the environment, I'm wondering through the whole history of these films you analyzed, how much, because it often seems that food happens, like how we perceive food happens either in the kitchen or in the restaurant, right? It's in a discrete fashion rather than food as a system, right? It goes from field to fork and beyond. So how much do you think disconnect between food as a system, food as a discrete object. You know, you alluded to food porn, right? This kind of focus and camera focused on food as a discrete object is present throughout this kind of food shaping our perception about food. And the films we tend to perceive it through. And I like that you ended on a note about food documentaries challenging a little bit our perception of food as an object. Thank you very much.
So you might notice that I love this question. What is most interesting to me about these films is what they don't talk about and how that then translates into our sense of cultural belonging and who gets to make a difference and who gets to have choices. So whether it's the environment, which does not get talked about in these films, it starts to come up in the documentary films. We felt like we had to end on a high note because I was so depressed about food media by the time we got through this. They avoid talking about the environment. They avoid talking about labor. You know, you'll see people who look like they're of Mexican descent lingering in the background, but they never become characters. They're pushed to literally pushed to the background. You're not supposed to think about it. So I think your point is spot on. And for us, it's one of the things that's come to define how this genre works. What is it we don't talk about and don't think about?
Literally stole my question. Not really, but going in that sort of order. I don't know if this is working. I come from I'm here after managing and cooking on the line throughout Manhattan. Just moved back from working on a farm for 7 years. Watching these, I've watched food films in a completely different aspect that I feel like a lot of people sometimes haven't. Fast Food Nation was probably the first one that was really sort of the nitty gritty. And as you talked about aesthetics, it's not what, I don't know if it's like the world, but maybe it's just American culture doesn't want to see. It's all that stuff that's like underlying and lurking. And then Chef came out, and I thought that was cool because that was a real portrayal of a chef where it followed the food truck theme that was kind of getting big at the time. I thought that was really neat. But when they showed his apartment and there's nothing in it, and the restaurant gear that you end up taking home, I have a lot of it, that just sort of makes your way into the kitchen. I was wondering, have you seen a trend where it's that, what was the word? It was pretty much along the same lines, an over falseness, I guess, of the food world.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Between, like, you see the restaurants and they're just like, they're uncrowded, there's no one running around and things of that nature. You can hear your conversation, or the waiter's actually nice to you, things like that. I mean, it seems like there's an exacerbation of proper etiquette that doesn't exist, or it exists to a limit. And I'm wondering if most of these the films are like that, and it's because they're keeping with that genre that you spoke of.
When we talk about these films as utopian, the point is not to say that this is a beautiful reality. It's that food gets anchored in these utopic visions that are so far removed from reality, and they invite us to distance ourselves from the politics of everyday life that really matter. So when we consume them and we take these stories in, it's over and over and over again, whether it's about race, sexuality, ethnicity. I'll give you a contrast of a film, and that's Babette's Feast. I don't know how long ago any of you watched it, but that film gets real about where food comes from. And you do not see this in the contemporary American narrative films. So you actually see a cow's head that's been cut off. And you see there's one, I think it's something en sarcophage. So it's quails in sarcophagi, in coffins. So it makes this linkage between death and life and food in a way that we never see that depicted in US films.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
I'm Roger Karlbach, amateur everything. You've gone 3/4 of the square. You've gone a book about movies, about food. And what I do, totally on a non-professional, no profit, no revenue stream, is close the square by, it's about food, about books. And it's in my book group. And when we meet at my house once a year, whatever book we've read, we have the menu devoted to either the locale of the book, be it India, Iowa, the South, Italy, or wherever, or foods that are mentioned in the book, like the movie The Price of Salt, which they made the movie Carol about, which has a lot of foods in it. But I took those foods out. They had lettuce, but it was set in the 50s, so I made one of those Jell-O molds and put it on lettuce. So it's my way of playing with my food, and I get a great deal of satisfaction from it. And I have all these menus from all these dinners that I've done, and it closes the square. I thought you might be interested.
That's very cool. Thank you. We were going to make a timpano, but it was too complicated to bring all the way from Stony Brook.
Hi. Oh, it's going to be a really quick question. My name is Chi-Hoon Kim. I'm a PhD candidate of food studies at Indiana University. I have a quick question about race, actually, because in classrooms, a lot of American students say America doesn't have a cuisine. And I know that a lot of the ethnic others that you were talking about in the food films that you analyzed have a very distinctive identity and culinary culture that they represent. And I was wondering, what does the non-ethnic films, what do they say about American cuisine?
Very often it's in the space of the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes sort of fine dining focused, most of the time, not always. Sometimes you have movies that look at lower class restaurants, for instance, Waitress, which now has been turned into
That's what I was thinking of.
A musical, of all things. But most of them, focus on the space of the restaurant, of the fine dining restaurant, as a place that doesn't need to be defined by race. While the ethnic restaurant is sort of the eatery, the mom and pop's place and whatnot, when you go to the fine dining, it's sort of understood that it's European-based food and the chefs are going to mostly be white. In today's special, one of the movies we discussed, the Indian chef is really fighting hard to become a sous chef and a chef, and people keep on telling him, yeah, but no, not really. And so these dynamics are shown in completely different way if you're in a certain kind of restaurant or in a
Because
more...
it seemed like your analysis of masculinity for white men was like this hyper-masculine rock star type role, and then for the women it was more kind of going back to the home and whatnot. So I guess those are kind of the tropes.
I mean,
that
if we start talking about the intersectionality in these movies, we could be here for the next 40 minutes, but there is a lot there to be said, definitely.
Thank you.
And regional, too.
Yeah.
There's definitely films that focus on regional cuisine. Fried Green Tomatoes, or Waitress, like you said, really focuses on pies.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a PhD student in food studies at NYU, and my focus is all on Middle Eastern food and specifically Palestinian and Israeli film. And so for me, sort of my classic food film is Lemon Tree, and so I'm very interested in Lemon Tree and Jaffa the Orange is Clockwork. And I think that both of these films have a very interesting role in sort of subverting narratives and racial and confessional sectarianism and splits. And a large way or an important way in which they do this is allowing not only maybe a dominant culture, but sort of minority cultures or subalterns to have voices within the films and to narrate their own realities as well. And so I'm wondering if there are instances, I'm not as aware of sort of the American food scene, if there are instances of American food films that allow for sort of subaltern voices to narrate their own identities. Thank you.
I mean, unless you're talking about something like Daughters of the Dust, so independent feminist films, you would see a lot of films that deal with subaltern voices. But the whole point about these films is that they want to make white viewers feel really comfortable kind of in the space of ethnic others without getting too close. So they always hold you at arm's length. They give you a tease. A lot of the films will actually move from ethnic cuisine to fusion. So fusion becomes the ultimate food. In other words, you make it upscale white food with a couple of traces of ethnicity left over. But they really tend to whitewash consistently. Can you think of an example, mainstream?
Not really.
Hello. I was curious if the two of you considered looking at films that focused on drink, in particular of Sideways or Beer Fest or Somm or the sour grapes?
Yeah, we have the one of the masculinity chapters has a piece about sideways, and we put that in there because it does something slightly different with masculinity. It actually doesn't just hold the women responsible for the men's bad behavior. The male, remember the lead character's name in Sideways?
Yeah,
I can't remember. I was just looking at it today. Paul Giamatti's character. Do you remember what his name was? It's going to drive me nuts. I'll have to read the book again. But he's not let off the hook because some woman comes in and saves him. He actually has to come back and deal with his own feelings. Not that it's completely gender positive, but it's definitely, I think there'd be a great other book on drink and film.
All right. Well, we'll be around. We'll be at the table signing books if you're interested, and there's also some cheese and wine on the other side. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming.
Great questions.